We are back for part 3 of our Masterclass series, and I'm joined by my good friend and specialist and leading accountant, Jeremy from KHI Partners. Now, in this particular episode, when we're doing part 3, we're taking a deep dive into the world of experienced investors. Now, experienced investors is a loose word because technically you could have a home, you could have one property, and as soon as you get the second, it could be deemed experienced because you're more than one. But then we can also see different types of clientele where experience might be 5, 3, 10, 15, 20, residential, commercial, high income salary, or just, your okay salaries, but been in the game for a long time, or you're extremely high business owners in terms of high profits, multiple entities. So we could go in all directions of this. But the main thing is in all those directions, the core here is that it's not your typical. It's not your majority, it's the minority. So this is an episode for the minority or for the majority who want to become the minority. However you want to look at it, we'll leave it with you. But I'm here joined by Jeremy. Jeremy, welcome, mate.
Mate, thank you again for having me on. I'm really excited for part 3 today. We get to really deep dive into, to what very successful people have been able to achieve and the level of wealth they've been able to obtain and how they structure that. Because we all know that that very top 0.1 or 1% of Australians, they do things very differently compared to the rest of us. And it's just adopting that top-down approach and being able to really absorb as much as we can. It doesn't have to be at the sophistication or the level of sophistication or the level and gravity of the structures that they've implemented. But if we can adopt some really good things and implement that into our own structures, especially early on, it helps us get into that minority and helps us to really think rich and grow rich at the same time.
Absolutely. And so in today's episode, mate, I'm keen to dig into a few of those swim lanes we've been talking about in the past few series. Things like structures, just because that in itself is one part alone, but also talking about, I guess, the key thing that always is the difficult part for many is how to work best with the right partner too, because I think that's not talked about as often. Everyone's happy to talk about a loan or a structure of this, but when you've got experienced, investors, I want to make sure that they gel well. They do ask the right questions. They're talking the right game, because then when they do, it's actually two to tango, right? So that's the key thing. Now, if we start off with structures, I know we could go in a few different ways here, but I guess let's start talking experienced in the lens of, I've got my home, I've got a couple properties, and maybe I did them on my own. Maybe some I did okay, some I did crappy on. And now maybe I've got a buyer's agent on my team, or I'm an investor without one. I just want to scale. I have goals to hit, kind of mapped them out, and everyone keeps saying, go speak to your accountant. Why are they speaking to you? What's happening in their mind now, Jeremy, for an experienced investor in their structures?
Yeah, so look, there's definitely different ways that all consultants work. And I'm a big believer of being, when I say proactive, it's not so much as we mentioned in our part 2 and part 1 of calling your clients every 10 seconds and finding out have they had their dinner or have they gone to the shops that day, but it's really being able to forward plan. So when I speak to clients, yes, we always talk about goals and objectives, but it's really more than that. It's about what the next purchase looks like beyond the purchase they've just made, or what the second and third or fourth or fifth purchase may look like. It's what they have the ability to do. Someone who is a business owner having large amounts of turnover and very good profit margins is definitely someone who's able to grow much quicker or grow much larger than someone who hasn't got the same capability. Not to put them on different levels or different paths, but sometimes the reality is the reality. So it's really understanding what the next step looks like just before you've made that one, and being proactive in that approach to get that good forward guidance to really then construct the right level of strategy and the right level of structure so that these people can continue to grow and grow in a way which is profitable, efficient, but also fits with inside their level of wealth that they're looking to obtain, and then how they want to disperse that wealth into the future. So, many clients, I will encourage them to buy, that 1, 2, 3, sometimes even 4 properties individually or in between their name or their spouse's name. And then we really start to dig into, well, what does their future, what do they want to look at, and what do they want it to look like? And then we can start to create the relative structure around it. So we'll look at, trusts come into play. Is a great way to hold investments, or they might want to get into corporate entities for trading purposes, and we establish companies. They might want to utilize their own super, for instance, to invest their own money the way they wish to. So we look at a self-managed super fund and its respective structure for purchasing assets. And then we really start to put that inside their structure tree. And we then start to create the level of tax planning around it. So they might want to be able to control a level of wealth and provide that dynasty level of wealth where they can trickle that down to the family. And a trust is a great way to do that, because you're able to distribute to the beneficiaries, Arjun, the profit that you've generated from your investments, whether it's property, shares, or other asset classes. And that is a way that you can retain a large portion potentially of the income that you're generating through distributing that to the most tax-effective beneficiaries. So there's multiple ways to cut this cake. It's really just looking forward. And that's something that I really try to extract from all my clients, so that when we do talk about structure, we're talking about it efficiently, effectively, and most importantly, applicable to their scenario.
Now, I want to throw a couple of things at you, because this is the part that even for me, I love trying to get deeper into this. There's the distributions to people. Am I right if I rapid fire a couple of things? Like, it's usually sort of the 18-year-old age that you can start distributing? Or is there stuff like in America where, they got the kids on wages, they're 3 years old or 6 years old? Does that exist in Australia, Jerry? How does that work?
Yeah, so in the past, it used to exist. You could distribute to minors up to $3,000 up until around about maybe 7 or 8 years ago. But that has changed, where minors now can only receive a very small token, about $400 odd.
Okay.
And most of the time, you'll find that by the time the accountant does the distribution and the tax level of benefit that's being gained, the cost far outweighs the benefit. So we generally don't do it. But when you've got children above the age of 18 and the circumstances are right, where their incomes are much lower or there's no income at all, then you've got the ability to potentially distribute up to $18,400 or slightly above that, with the tax-free threshold income tax offset against it, which essentially means that in most cases that these minors can earn up to $20,000 tax-free. Now, there are some rules around it. You do need to disperse it to them. You do need to disperse the cash to them. It can't be on a gift and loan back arrangement or a distribution and loan back arrangement. It all needs to be done legitimately under the Section 100A guidelines. But nevertheless, that is a great way to be able to grow the family wealth. And again, if we look at the top-down approach, we look at the Reinhardts of the world and we look at these billionaires, they haven't set up trust to just protect assets. They set up trust, obviously, to filter through to the majority of the beneficiaries that they have, and that is a way that they're able to disperse the level of income. So it's a great way to, and again, I've used that word multiple times, Arjun, dynasty. It's a great way to grow family wealth. And I think a lot of cultures in Australia, especially a lot of newly migrated cultures into Australia, have that always in the back of their mind, that it's here not just for us, but it's here for the family to grow, to build, and then to cement themselves into the Australian wealth market.
Now, with that physical distribution, is that more like it could sit in your accounts, but if they wanted, they can take it? Is that kind of what you're saying?
No. So a trust needs to distribute all profits. So effectively, at the end of every financial year, the bank account should be zero. And the beneficiary then respectively pays the tax based on the distribution that they've received. So hence the reason that we need to look at the beneficiaries which are on lower tax rates than potentially yourselves as investing. And there are other options. There's a term called corporate beneficiary. And sometimes when people have lost all of the tax efficiency, being able to distribute to physical human beneficiaries, they then distribute it to corporate beneficiaries, such as a company. And in that particular instance where it doesn't pass the passive income test, the tax rate would be at 30%.
Which still might be lower than people on 45 top brackets, right?
45 plus Medicare levy. So that's 47% in most cases, Arjun. And if you've got a tax rate of 30% with the cash being dispersed to a corporate beneficiary or a company, for instance, in this case, you're able to build up a lot of wealth or a lot of cash in that company at a lower tax rate, effectively keeping more of your dollars in hand. That company doesn't have to just retain cash, although a bit attractive when the interest rates are at 4 or 5% compared to where they were couple of years ago, but nevertheless, that company then can look to invest that money. It can invest that money in any asset class it wants. And again, you should have a chat with your professional to determine the best structure to do it. But there are opportunities to invest a lot more post-tax dollars due to the lower tax rate into other investments and other asset classes. So it's a great way, if you use structure effectively, to be able to retain a lot more dollars. And as I said, to build up a lot of that family dynasty wealth.
Right. So it's almost like we're taking phase one is the personals and we're then going into entities. and then you're using that offspring, distribution, all that sort of stuff. But then after that gets kind of weaned out, it goes into potential corporate entities, right? Now, with the kids, I guess that doesn't last forever, because technically, let's just say a typical family, an 18 to 24-year-old studying, and then they go off to jobs, unis, and then you can't keep pumping them because they're going to be like, Mom, Dad, what are you doing? I kind of want to pay my own tax, live my own thing, do my own work. Can you stop putting me on top tax brackets? I'm just kind of, on the first level here. So this is when you start looking at these companies. Now, with the companies, I know I might be taking this to an extreme level. Is this kind of the move that family offices start getting created from? Where they start going, hey, we've got lots of successful businesses, but now we're using these companies that are saving us tax from these businesses we have, or putting in our personal name, and we're using these offices to go out there and invest more. Could we go to the extremes and then come back down?
Absolutely, yes. A lot of family investment firms or family investment companies are established in very similar fashion. So a lot of their income that they generate, and as we all know, the rich don't spend, they invest. That's their terminology, and they'll distribute a large portion of their investment earnings that they generate from their properties into, say, for instance, a corporate beneficiary. That corporate beneficiary might be an investment company, and then it goes out and makes its own investment. It could be private lending. It could be using that money to develop. There's many different things that it can do. It's really unlimited. There's circumstances where you do need to make sure that you always check off with your accountant, solicitor, or financial planner to ensure, again, it's the right structure moving forward. But it's very unlimited what you can utilize that money for to continue its own growth. But yeah, structure becomes a web and can become very large, or you can do it on a very simplistic basis. But nevertheless, when you start hitting, that $2-3 million worth of wealth, Arjun, definitely you need to make sure that some form of structure comes into play. And it's a matter of looking forward, not so much looking at today, but looking forward to see how you can best utilize it.
And so, Jeremy, now that we've got the different concepts of the trusts and the different vehicles starting to come into play, when does a client of yours who's an experienced investor decide one trust is not enough and they need more, and why?
Yeah, so there's no rule of thumb of, what a trust should have in it before you start establishing a second or a third. But I, as a personal investor, I like to create certain values in trusts. And it comes back to the eggs in your separate basket concept. If you've got all of your wealth in, for instance, one entity, then that one entity is exposed based upon whatever assets are inside it and what those assets are doing. So you might be in the business of residential properties. You might have a number of residential properties in your trust. There might be some things in your property that haven't been maintained. You've been notified about it, and your insurance policy doesn't cover if there's something that's negligent that occurs. So for me personally, Arjun, I'll like to have about anywhere between 1.5 to a couple $1 million worth of value in a trust before I look to establish my second one. There might be very rare circumstances that I establish one much sooner than that. For instance, there's a couple properties that I've bought where my business plan on this property well into the future is to develop it, turn that one property into a small block of units. And rather than having one rental income, I'll have, say, 10 rental incomes. Rather than having a value of $1.5 million, it might be valued by the end of it of, say, $5.5 million. So you've really got to make sure that you're matching the asset and, again, what's happening in the future to that asset, to the business plan, and then the structure.
Right. That makes sense. And now that's when you're kind of thinking of just also its risk as well when it's in one vehicle versus the other. And that's where you're kind of thinking across multiple. Now, with the trust aspect here, there is one thing that kind of pisses me off with trust. And I'm trying to figure out how the best way I can understand the moment in which it's like, hey, this still makes sense, or it definitely makes sense. And this is a hard one I find to explain. This is where you might be best fit here. There's land taxes on one side that are way higher in trusts for some states than others. Like, for example, a 950K place that I bought in Adelaide that I did in a trust. Without the land tax, it's like, without a trust, it's like 1K land tax, maybe less per annum. But then in it, I estimated the calculators of SA and I was like, it's like 3-4K. So firstly, I'm like already going backwards with that. Then I've got my annual fees for that trust. Then I'm not distributing the losses while I hold that. I get there's a future state in which that exists. But how do you best quantify the break even, the profit point, just mentally for super numbers people like me who struggle to go, and then you know what I do? I just put on the side and go, because the accountant said so. And I just go and freaking do it. And I'm like, come on, man. I hope people aren't buying properties from me just because the buyer's agent said so. I want you guys to like know it, understand it, feel it. Do you know what I mean? So could you give me some background to how I best quantify that, just to maybe help an experienced investor go, makes sense, I'm definitely doing this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And you need to look at that pros and cons, profit versus loss analysis. And look, some states have land tax thresholds for trusts, some don't. You know, for instance, New South Wales, it does not have a land tax threshold for a trust. So quite commonly, I'll try to tell people to buy the property, if it's in New South Wales, for instance, in either their name or their spouse's name, or combined if they're buying it, if they wish to. And the reason for that is it's really to absorb the land tax threshold. Once you've absorbed that land tax threshold in that state with your individual name, then all bets are off. Trust in your own name, the numbers are still relatively the same. But if you're going to be buying a property in a trust in a state that is not friendly from a land tax threshold point of view, where buying it in your own name it would be, well, then you really need to take into account what's the business plan of this property. You know, if the business plan of this property is that, hey, it's got the ability to be substantially positively geared through many of the different manufactured style of strategy that I can create, well, then you need to start to look at, well, okay, I've got an extra $2-3 in costs that I need to factor in for land tax and costs of the trust itself. But with that 15 to 20 grand of revenue that it's generating, if I'm able to distribute that, say, to my child, who at the moment is 18, not working, I'm going to be saving, say, anywhere between 6 to 7 grand tax if it was in my own name. So by saving that 6 to 7 grand tax versus that 3 to 4 grand loss, I'm still net positive ahead. And then you've got to look at the compounding return in the future. Those numbers will significantly grow with inflation on both sides of the equation, the cost and income. We just hope the income starts to move a lot quicker than the cost does. So they're the analysis that you need to make sure that you're doing, that profit and loss, that cost versus benefit. And in some cases, sometimes the cost outweighs the benefit, and it's the right decision not to purchase that property in the trust. So there are things to consider. But you look at WA, for instance, the land tax threshold of a trust and an individual are exactly the same. Queensland, by memory, there's about 600 versus 300 to 350 personal versus trust. New South Wales, about 900, 950 individual threshold versus nothing in a trust.
Yeah.
We won't talk about Victoria, Arjun. They're just land tax unfriendly for everybody, especially with their recent changes coming down to a 50 grand threshold. But nevertheless, that is something you always need to really review the equation and to really understand, well, are these additional costs going to get me this additional level of benefit? Am I spending money to make a lot more, or am I spending money to make a lot less?
Got it. And when it comes to those in the buying phase now, there becomes two types of decisions, right? Where people typically on the earlier and growing careers, young or lower salaries, start to have residential as a cornerstone of wealth building. And it makes sense. But then as you start to have very high income professionals or business owners, they start to be a lot more comfortable and desire cash flow because they see property not just for its future, which residential does from the compounding growth and one day being debt free, but they see it from a business transaction that year, which brings on commercial cash flow. I know I've got my own ways to look at when is right, but in your way, when you've got clients with incomes that could range to some pretty large levels, how do you help them in consideration of when commercial, when versus residential? Because I find customers also struggle to know when's right for them. So how do you help them kind of get that feeling as you're going from an experienced investor? Because then these vehicles play a part as well in that too.
Yes, I think first and foremost, like many businesses, you focus on a P&L, but you've always got to look after the balance sheet. To be able to grow, we obviously need to be able to utilize equity. And sometimes equity might come faster in the residential space than it does in the commercial space. Although we saw in the last couple of years as interest rates hit all-time lows, commercial property from an equity position, I think probably outperformed, say, residential. But nevertheless, you look historically, residential's outperformed commercial from a capital growth play. But that may change at any particular time depending on rates or depending on supply and demand. But we'll take all those things out of the equation. Once you're comfortable with where your balance sheet sits, once you're comfortable with your denominator, which is your asset value, Arjun, then you need to start to think about that pivot and rebalance into cash flow. Because I still to this day haven't been able to bring my balance sheet to Woolworths and be able to pay my groceries with my balance sheet. Unfortunately, they want what's the money in my bank account from when I swipe my card. So cash flow does become very important, but it's at what stage it becomes very important. You know, if you've got very solid incomes, you've got a great business potentially that's really humming, or your employment's doing well and you're kicking goals and getting promoted, then maybe cash flow is not something you need just yet, because you've got that cash flow coming in from your employment. Maybe you're after just that capital growth and building up that balance sheet wealth. Over time, when cash flow does become more important, you're taking a step back from work, or you may have sold your business, or you're looking over the next 5 to 10 years to retire, then you need to make that pivot and that rebalance out of balance sheet wealth and into cash flow wealth. And it comes back to that old saying, you know, asset rich, cash flow poor. And I know many clients, especially many older clients, who are substantially asset rich, but when you factor in the, you know, significant repairs and maintenance on their older properties and the land tax is one of the biggest killers for them. Combine that with what I believe is a very low rental income due to the age of the property, because it's got a lot more development potential than as opposed to just a standard dwelling on a block of land. They struggle to pay bills. They're constantly behind. They're constantly behind on council rates and water rates and land tax bills. Again, asset rich, cash flow poor. But if they pivot, which means potentially selling down a portion of their portfolio, yes, there's some tax, and lots of people don't sell and will continue to struggle because they do not want to pay tax. And tax to me is just a form of doing business. And if you structure things right, you can reduce that. But nevertheless, if they paid down some of their portfolio and put that money into different types of assets, Arjun, where there is a much better cash flow return, well, then that's ultimately where you can start to benefit. I've mentioned to you this before, and I say this to a lot of clients. I've got a client who has a large property portfolio, substantially large, well over $30 million. And it was all unencumbered, no debt. Absolutely zero debt. And this is a client who worked his backside off, very strong business, sold it, paid off all his investment properties. In the interim, the land tax bill started to get higher and higher and higher, to being close to about 60 to 70% of the overall rental income.
Wow.
Because these properties were valued at $4 and $5 million, the rents were only about $1,500 a week, $1,600 a week. And by the time he paid the land tax, which averaged to be about $900 to $1,000 a week, property agent fees, council rates, water rates, repairs and maintenance, this gentleman was only left with about a couple $100,000 on his 30 million plus portfolio.
Wow.
He sold down a portion of the portfolio because that was the advice that we received. We saw these issues in the writing on the wall. He was able to restructure after paying a couple $1 million worth of capital gain tax debt, restructure some of that capital, close to about 8 or 9 million, into various different asset classes where there was a much higher rate of return. And he's turned his $200,000 passive income from a 30 mil portfolio to now well over $600,000-700,000 a year.
Massive. And I guess
so that's a genuine pivot from P&L to from balance sheet to P&L.
Massive pivot. It's a very important part, right? Because business as well, for those listening in business, it's delayed gratification. Like it's the 1%ers, like very 1% of like business owners that actually start a business that go, yeah, super profitable, super successful in year one. Like it takes time. And what you're showing is that as you build that portfolio, as you transition, as you pivot, you get to that delayed gratification. That is the high income that comes from a well-structured portfolio. So, mate, thank you for sharing a story like that with regards to the pitfalls, because you've made me think of a journey, which is the strategy that we believe in, which is acquire, optimize, consolidate. Yes, buyer's agents, the word buyer, buying, buy is all over that word buyer's agent. But the truth is, consolidate is such a key part, and restructuring like that. And for those that don't know, two of the biggest things that I believe in as well at a later stage of life is you don't want to be paper rich. You want to be cash flow rich later in life. Be very paper rich at your barbecues in your 20s, 30s, and 40s. But your 40s, 50s, and 60s, it's all about, how cash flow rich you are, not paper rich, not how many quantity of things. Just to give you an example, two things, Jeremy, that I think, one of them I learned massively off you back in the days. And I may not have told you this before, but I am now rent vesting. And I do plan to go into the home that I one day will build. But you actually taught me the value of an owner-occupied property, because immediately the bias of an investment-based buyer's agent is to talk nothing but investing and never talk a home. And I fall into the trap at the start of my career thinking, yeah, invest, invest, invest. But then I realize a home that grows in value, that you then downsize tax-free if things remain the same, outweighs an investment that you sell that did really well. And then when you have that home that's downsized, you've killed all this ego, paper, rich, $4, $5, $6 million home you're in, because in that future value, don't be surprised everyone tuning in, your 1-2 mil home with the 5 to 6% compounding growth rates might be something crazy like 6 to 7 mil if all those things play out, right? But if that happens, you downsize, tax-free, clear off today's inflation impacted debt because the debt's in today's dollars. And all of a sudden, that's an example of this consolidation you talk about. And suddenly you go, oh, wow, look at what I bought this in. It's a trust. And now I've got this positive income because they're debt-free investments. And now I'm distributing them safely, correctly. And this is that long-term delayed gratification. And then moving to the next part, there's also that commercial aspect, which some people don't know about. Land taxes can be paid by the tenant on a single holding land tax. So imagine you've got a $5 million resi portfolio and a $5 million singular multi-shop or a massive commercial property. There are leases out there where the tenant pays the land tax for that single holding. And so this is a perfect example of what you've talked about, Jeremy, where you've said, hey, the pivots, the paper turning into real cash flow, large metrics turning into actual usable cash. And this is a key part for investors tuning in. So Jeremy, how often do you see those things come up where you've talked about, the lack of understanding in commercial, where you now need to use examples like this, and also people with their home, no home, thinking about homes and how they play a role? How do you think about that for experienced investors? Is it pretty much like that I've said, or is there some other things to think about on their journey as well?
No, well, you've hit the nail on the head with many of the comments and many of the conversations that I have. I think, and I don't mind, I hope no one listening out here thinks that I think the investment strategy's wrong, because I actually think the investment strategy is fantastic. And when it's executed the right way, it can become super profitable, because sometimes I do see our own homes, for many clients, becoming a large anchor for us to grow, because we've bought that spectacular house pretty early on in the piece and we've got ourselves into a lot of debt, and it becomes that anchor that just hits the bottom of the ocean floor and we just simply can't drag it back up. So I think getting it right and getting the balance right between potentially owning your own home or rent vesting. I do see very many times rent vesting strategies, Arjun, where people have invested their whole life, which is great. They don't want to sell any of their investment properties and they've essentially borrowed themselves out of ever buying their own home.
Yeah.
And then they're forced to sell a property because their ideas have changed and they might not be selling at the optimum time. So I think it's constantly reviewing your strategy with your professionals and especially your mortgage broker, and making sure that have I left enough room or space in the bag, to continue to put more things in. But very openly with clients, I'm always constantly discussing with them and challenging them that, guys, at the moment, where are we? Where do you think you want to be? Are you comfortable? How's employment? How's the business? Do you see yourself working for the next 10 years? And, most people are pretty open and pretty honest. And sometimes they say, I'm ready to finish up in the next 5 years, and we'll start that transition, or we'll assist them with the right people to start that transition. And some people say, no, I've still got the fire in the belly. And, they're along their capital growth acquisition phase, they continue. But it's always making sure that you're looking after both sides of that balance sheet and P&L.
Yeah.
And making sure you're getting that balance optimum and just right, so that you can continue to build wealth. There's no point focusing on a balance sheet too much, Arjun, as we've seen in 2022, especially in the tech sector in the US. A lot of these very heavy balance sheet based businesses with significant cash flow losses, they're gone.
Yeah.
And they very rarely will recover. But, you look at your old traditional blue chip entities where they've just got a very strong balance sheet and an even stronger P&L, and they just continue to thrive on, and they'll be there for many years to come. So again, we spoke about top-down approach. What people need to do is not look at the top and say, I'll never get there, but you've got to adopt what the top is doing and find a way to bring it to your level, again, according to your circumstances.
This is special, my friend. And I guess if I was to recap, I'm going to do my best for those bullet point loving listeners here. We're going to try and summarize this special conversation on more experienced investors. So if I'm understanding correctly, step one is we're starting to move into turning from a acquisition-focused starting period of buying to now running a business. And it sounds like in running a business, we're like building wealth, then turning it into how we optimize that wealth with certain structures and vehicles, and then turning into our pivots where needed to make sure we get the right balance of balance sheet, P&L, goals.
That's it.
And on this journey, we talked about trusts. We talked about the use of these trusts with future generations. And then when you start, getting gassed out in a few areas, you might consider entities. And through entities, there might be subsequent investment vehicles, and the balance between different states, taxes in those states as a core consideration too, from land tax when you decide, I set up certain entities, I don't, and using that cost-benefit analysis we talked about to be able to make sure that we can figure out when it might work, when it might not work, with your long-term business plan in play. And then as you're going on the journey, whatever you want to call it, keep hustling, keep holding, keep driving, keep staying in communication. And then from there, it's about deciding, hey, is the fire in me to keep on acquiring? Do you transition to focusing on the pivots that generate the most income? And don't stress, don't sweat selling. In scenarios like the $30 million investor, from paying the land tax that much, I'm sure they wanted more money to go towards them than other ways in land taxes, right? So this has been a special conversation in my journey. This has helped me a lot for me personally, and I hope that what helps me helps all the listeners. And I think when it comes to taking a step back and looking at the 3 steps of Masterclass, we've gone, firstly, what are structures? What are we doing them? Rewind back to part 1 for anyone tuning in. We've then gone into part 2 and started going into the mind of a first-time or starting investor and when to consider different names versus different entities versus ownership splits versus which states, not non-certain states from a tax perspective. And then now we moved to the experienced investors and we started going into something fancy, the corporate trustee as well, or the beneficiary that you set up, or some people call them bucket companies. And then moving into how we think of the exit, because that's not talked about as often, Jeremy. We always talk about buying. Buying's cool. Research is cool. Data's cool. But the pivot, the exit, all that coming together. Made any last words to add to those tuning into this 3-part masterclass and going back into it?
Yeah, and I think we've covered a lot of great content. It's making sure that what works for you is applicable to your circumstances. It's not a one size fits all. You really need to make sure that you're creating that level of plan. And I think we spoke about it a number of times. We spoke about business. Now, this podcast has got nothing to do with business. We're not talking about, scaling businesses from 1 employee to 100 or, 1 million to 100 million. We're talking about treating property as our business.
Correct.
And most people will invest more money in property than they will in business. Yet they treat sometimes business with more emphasis than their investment or their property portfolio. So I think the main thing is for everybody to have the mindset that your property portfolio is a business. You've got to constantly look at it, review it, take care of it. You've got to make sure that you're reviewing your numbers, talking to the right level of professionals as if any business owner would, and then having the strategies. And I think you hit the nail on the head again with the exit strategy. So many people do not have an exit strategy, and I think that needs to be factored in, not too early on in the piece, but at least halfway through, so you know that you've got different directions to take, whether it's a asset reduction and a capital increase, or it could be an asset reduction and a cash flow increase, could be a debt reduction strategy. There's multiple ways to really get that level of retirement or that level of income that you're after.
Mate, some very, very wise words. Thank you so much. And when it comes to those who look at this 3-part masterclass and want to reach out to Jeremy and feel like, hey, you know what, this has been extremely valuable. I want an accountancy firm like that to help me look at property like a business, look at my life with the end goal in play, look at the different ways I want to structure my business and how I look at cost-benefit analysis of investing. And more importantly, just have a communication line that can be more structured rather than just whenever. Reach out to Jeremy at KHI Partners. Jeremy, what's the best way to reach out?
Yeah, just to contact us on our contact page, khipartners.com.au.
Thank you so much, my friend. And for those tuning back once more, please do go back to part 1, part 2, part 3. Get those refreshers on the structure. Structures were just one part of it. It was a greater piece of business and structures. But my biggest takeouts were what was shared at the end of the session for me personally in my portfolio. And there are others at different phases of their journey they'll take out more in part 1 or part 2. But in summary, there's risk protection, there's business management, there's tax effectiveness, there's borrowing capacity strengths through multiple entities, and there's obviously the right communication with your accounting partner. So I hope this helps and hope you've enjoyed the masterclass. And if you did, give me an email, give me a connection on LinkedIn, drop me a note. We'll do more like this with Jeremy on other topics, with others in other areas, because just thought of trying something new on a podcast where we went through a bit of a series. And Jeremy, thank you, mate, for making this happen. Appreciate it.
Thanks, mate. Always a pleasure.
Cheers.